Welcome to the Port Huron Statement. This episode is not so specifically focused. It's kind of on the broader trend towards cronyism and the way that assorted, events, legislations, political ideologies, civil rights movements have enabled through, what you'd kind of call dirty tricks for the advancement of a crony state and a crony economy. Let's start with, first, how the women's liberation movement was enabled to allow the stagnation of middle income buying power, and that there was an intentioned moralization of the two-earner household. If you didn't have two earners, it was your fault if you weren't financially stable, even though the previous generation was guaranteed the income to purchase a home with pretty much any full-time employment. And so in order to pick up the slack that had been created through eroding buying power for the entire middle class, the women's liberation movement was essentially co-opted to enable that stagnation and make it less visible, because you could dedicate the second parent to work and patch up what was a failure of economic equity. And that was strange. I really want to get rid of those, but I liked my opening. Man, it hurt your flow. Yeah, definitely the women's liberation movement is justified. Absolutely. And we still haven't realized equality in the genders in terms of income. But that brings me to another point, that actually most of the inequality right now has to do with legacy employment, in the sense that baby boomers that entered the job market before general equality of the genders have disproportional larger buying power because of their entrance into the labor market before all of these maneuvers that have diluted buying power. And so their expectation of income, plus the fact that as a baby boomer you entered the workforce at a general higher level with a much greater chance for ascendance because of World War II, the silent generation. A lot of vacancies were created in management, executive levels, because of the war, and also because of the huge boom in industry in the United States related to exporting to satisfy global demand related to the destruction of World War II, which leads us to another interesting twist of what should have been a justifiable advance in our culture, which is civil rights, has interestingly been utilized to enable cronyism through the removal of any aptitude-based test in the bureaucracy. So before 1980, as a means of removing cronyism in politics and political appointments, they created a series of tests that would assure that any appointment would be adequately capable of the position, and also create a standard by which you could judge the relative suitableness of a candidate. And this in 1980 was judged to be racist, and it was because they were manipulating this in a way to advantage certain candidates. So it's being utilized for cronyism because it wasn't being produced in a good faith way. But that doesn't mean that the very idea of trying to hire based on capability and understanding the material is flawed. It means that tailoring a test to specifically cater to one race or the other is definitely not, appropriate. But that, essentially, that court finding that the tests were racially biased was utilized to keep putting off the creation of a test to the point now where it's not even remembered historically that there once was an expectation of performance and capability as the primary determinant of whether or not you should be selected for government service. And so right now the only thing that determines whether you're capable and should be selected is your political social network. So by using the racial bias as a means of destroying the entirety of objectivity in hiring, they've made it so it's not just racially biased, but it's incredibly ideologically and politically biased. And so again, my point is that the underlying ethical demand is right. We do need to have gender equality, and we shouldn't be using tests to keep races or genders or anyone out, but it's being utilized now to excuse profound cronyism and to enable the complete, deterioration of the middle class. And also you have to remember that this buying power stagnation is sort of what led to the 1980s and 90s entire deportation of U.S. industry, mostly to initially like Japan and Taiwan and then China. And their lack of progress in terms of humanitarian progress is directly related to their exports to the United States and the fact that they're wanting a human rights stance is entirely enabled and justified by the relationship with the United States. It's financed by the billionaire class of the United States and millionaire class too, that have access to production industry in China, essentially are given this enormous advantage economically because they can leverage a population whose currency is artificially depressed by their government. Because it's an insular economy, this doesn't have a very big impact on their ultimate buying power. So even though they're making such a fraction of what you would make in America, the buying power is actually better than minimum wage in America. But this enables the disenfranchisement of American workers because it allows this class of industrialists to produce things at, literal pennies on the dollar, not because of anything other than currency and political manipulation of the working class in China to exploit the consumer class in the United States and ultimately erode the total amount of resources and wealth and ultimately political capital that is possessed by the middle class. And then we can get to the destruction of the labor unions and how that enabled the destruction of the two-party system in the United States. So when Reagan became president, he essentially destroyed all of the national unions, but a couple. Essentially, at this point, within 3 years, 2/3 of the federal unions were essentially gone. And, right to work and all these different legislations. And this was a goal because the DNC was entirely funded by, not entirely, but largely funded by labor unions, just like the RNC is funded by corporations. But after they destroyed the labor unions, the DNC then has those terrible showings during the Reagan administration. And this results ultimately in the Clinton Democrat, which is a corporate-funded Democrat because the Democrats didn't have any way to really compete with the Republicans being awash with funding through the corporate channel. And so, yeah, once Clinton wins the presidency, that establishes both major parties as primarily corporate funded, and completely changes the entire political landscape, because there's no then desire to undo the Reagan-era policies that are ultimately exploiting civil rights legislations. And then we have the Clinton administration, which advances the free trade element across the Americas and globally, which has wreaked havoc on a lot of, small farming communities in Mexico, for example. But more than that, it's prevented the Chinese from having the agency to actually demand better conditions because of the glut of American money that's enabling the CCP to dominate the country. I mean, the relationship between American industrialists and the billionaire class and the Chinese CCP is incredibly tight because they both profit so immensely and depend on one another. So any veneer that the U.S., donor class does not love the CCP is crazy, because the CCP, their communist regime, is what is necessary to enable that enormous discrepancy in the actual domestic buying power versus international buying power, which is what's requisite to allow such an enormous amount of industrial input at such an incredibly depressed price, enabling the political suppression and economic, disenfranchisement of the middle class at large in America, and preventing any wage escalation in China, because the very reason that they have this access to American wealth is because of the fact that it's so cheap. But, again, the billionaire class in America depends on them because they're not talented, so they need this huge advantage, one. And two, if the middle class were to become employed and well-informed, they would become aware of the outright theft. And so this enormous amount of profit is mostly utilized for really a massive corporate/political propaganda campaign to convince the American people that the problems that they face require solutions that only will exacerbate the problem by increasing the amount of wealth in the hands of those people that are creating the problem. And that leads me to the financial manipulations, like the, removal of the gold standard, which I don't believe in a gold standard, but you need to have some standard, because what they're doing right now is they're just printing money and deciding who they give it to. And, for example, in the past 5 years, they have printed something like 4 times more money in the past 5 years than they have in 100. And then when you talk about since the year 2000, we're talking about well over 90% of all the money that's ever been printed has been printed in that period of time. And it's given to banks and, and then they in turn give it to people that, have credit and stuff like that. But what's happening is through quantitative easing and through IORB, which is how they create a floor on the treasury bond market. So they're creating all of these enormous injections of cash, printings of cash, to bolster the wealthiest and most politically connected individuals through liquidation of this enormous amount of cash through the banks, while restricting access to this same cash from the there's an outside my fucking door. Is he trying to block off the road? Anyway, so to offset the access to cash for the middle and lower classes, and then create massive inflation, which will then result in their losing of their buying power and their savings. This is a draconian system of suppression, deception, and control of media and capital. as a way to excuse and silence it. And this is then further enabling really, really disgusting personal manipulations of the population. And it's unconscionable. And I'm going to go into more specifics in the immediate future. I just wanted to, I guess, touch on a bunch of disparate things that come together to oppress this population. And they really can't be ignored anymore, because they also have a huge environmental impact. Because of this artificial movement of wealth, you have like this great example of the water in Mexico and the sales of broccoli to the United States, because the sale of agriculture in Mexico results in more money if it's sold in America, so they keep exporting their agriculture up here, which results in all the agriculture holds water, and it's moved tons of water to America, and this is now resulting in really poor water quality in a lot of these agricultural communities. So their investment from American corporations into their agro-business is drying up, and so not only is their water crap, but now they're getting poorer and poorer and poorer, and ultimately that is just sucking resource from one place, bringing them to another place, but then the whole time we're misusing them, and it's creating desperation everywhere. And what's happening is then that desperation is then seized upon to convince people to do sociopathic things in order to survive. I mean, they are seizing on the very desperation that they're creating, and that's part of the strategy. So that's why they're not changing this desperate freaking environmental situation, because it's enhancing their leverage. Yeah, this guy's looking right at me. I gotta go.